Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your conference. I've been involved in the Cochrane collaboration for quite a long time, just a touch before JBI started, but not long before. But as you heard from my little bio there, I've come late to academia. So I've got the task of telling you about IPD, individual participant data reviews. So just a short description of what they are. So it's when you actually get your original research data, the raw data for each participant in each study, and you get it directly from the researchers. You don't get it from a publication. So this means you're able to explore and drill down much further than you can from a publication. And there's a nice little description in Chapter 18 of the Cochrane Handbook. So some people would say that IPDs, I'm going to say IPD from now on because it's much easier to say, are the gold standard of evidence synthesis, but I've put a question mark there because we might want to debate that. But they're likely to be increasing, but they're increasing from a pretty low base, as you can see from that little graph there. Really, they only started in 1994, and they have, they seem to be having an upward inflection. 2014 was quite a good year for IPDs. I wonder whether that increase will still go up or whether we'll dip down. So there are about 300 IPDs to date that have been done according to Debray and colleagues. And the feeling is that they might be particularly helpful when we're looking at controversial therapeutic areas. I'll give you a couple of examples so you can orient yourself. The earlier IPDs were really large-scale trials. And so here's one. Both these examples are from the early breast cancer trialist collaborative group. So looking at radiotherapy and breast cancer. And a massive amount of data that they're looking at there. Nearly 11,000 women, 17 RCTs. Another one about polychemotherapy regimens, again early breast cancer. 100,000 women, 123 trials. So some of the advantage of IPDs that I think are helpful, as I've just said, you might be able to include unpublished trials or where data's not been fully reported. Does avoid reliance on just the published results, and most often you can include more outcomes and participants than you would from an aggregate systematic review. One particularly important thing is the ability to get in there and get your outcomes standardised and your definitions so that you can potentially pull more data. You have to have a consistent method of analysis across all the trials. Also allows you to do time to event analyses such as survival in cancer, which is not easy to do in a straightforward systematic review of interventions. Some of the most important things, however, are about obtaining greater power so you can look at interactions in a much more reliable way for modifying effects. And also important, but perhaps sometimes under-realised advantage is that to do this you have to be collaborating with trialists and you have to form a collaboration and you have to work together and you have to trust each other, and that's a perfect environment. Once you've got all of those ticks, you're well on the way to being able to understand the implications for research and practice. By the time you've done this in a collaborative way, you know all about not only your trial but everybody else's trial, and a useful reference there at the end. But the downsides, they take much more time, they're much more costly. You have to get specific statistical expertise, and there are a handful of statisticians in the world that really can do the relevant IPD analyses. It's a lot of hard work, toing and froing, harmonising and checking the data in order to do the analyses. The stuff that you get from your trialists is in very different formats. Sometimes that's not too much of a problem if it's in automated form, but one experience that one of our groups had was the only thing they had was paper records. So we laboriously extracted out the relevant data for some hundreds of participants. There are some areas, and I think you might have touched on it earlier this morning, trialists may not be so motivated about sharing their data. You know, they've done that trial, they don't want to revisit old ground. They may not be willing to share their data for reasons we'll allude to, and you might talk about that later. They may no longer have the data, and I've put a couple of dots there. Maybe they didn't even have the data, so there's some real issues about what IPD may uncover and the response of trialists. Okay, so there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about data sharing, and IPD is one way of doing that data sharing, and Judah Smith and colleagues have looked at what we should really be doing to improve this data sharing. So would it improve things if we could guarantee controlled and secure access of the data, and seeking consent when we share the IPD that participant confidentiality and privacy is maintained? Resourcing is a very big question, and can we have some way of trying to share resources, get resources from trial funders, sponsors and users of IPD? Well, why do an IPD if you can have an aggregate review? And Judah Smith, aforementioned, and colleagues have done some very nice work, and this is a Cochrane review, a methodological review, not one of interventions. And what they found here were 39 relevant studies comprising 190 individual patient data and aggregate data comparisons. Comfortingly, 80% of the comparisons did agree, but more IPD than aggregate comparisons showed statistical significance, but it's only 28 out of 38. And also, interestingly to me, the discrepancies between the two types of reviews didn't increase with trial numbers or size. So their conclusion was average difference is small, but the limits of agreement are wide and include important differences in both directions. So it's a bit of a sitting on a fence here. Is aggregate or IPD better? But you can drill down in aggregate reviews. So why don't we just do that a bit more in our aggregate reviews? So I've got an example here on a review that's my bête noire. It's taken me a long time to finish, but antenatal omega-3, and the particular area here that I want to use as an example is the timing of preterm birth. So normally preterm births, less than 37 weeks gestation, and a nice number of trials that I've collected, well, not a huge number actually, it's 18 out of 60 or so now, report less than 37 weeks gestation, about 8,000 women involved. Less than 34 weeks, there's only 9 trials reporting that, and about half the number of participants. So 50% of the data's missing because it wasn't reported in the published trials, although, of course, it could have been. And I could go and write to, well, the other 40 or so trials that didn't report it, but that's a lot of work. So that's another indication why aggregate reviews may not always cut the mustard. Okay, well, what about subgroup analysis? Why couldn't we just do more subgroup analysis and aggregate reviews? So here, you're not going to be able to read the detail of that, but that's not important. So it's just an example. So the first subgroup is nulliparous women, The second subgroup is multiparous women, and the third subgroup is either. So women who've not had any children and women who've had one or more children. So that third subgroup is absolutely useless. It doesn't tell us anything. So, and there's very sparse data, extremely sparse data as I look at it now, in subgroups 1 and 2. So often we're faced with this sorts of situation when we do subgroup analyses in aggregate reviews. We can do the mathematics of it, and it's very nice, and it comes out and tells me that there's not a subgroup interaction, a significant result, but there is an effect, and the effect in this case is maternal infection. But it doesn't take me any further. I just know that in planned birth versus expectant management, this is when women's membranes have ruptured, there's going to be less infection in the planned birth group. But I don't know any more than that. I can't get any more data from here. So, the stats. I'm not a statistician, so accept my humble attempt at this. There are two main choices for an IPD. The two-stage is actually the traditional approach. That's doing a kind of what you do in an aggregate review, each study separately and then putting them together in a fairly traditional meta-analysis model. The newer thinking is around a one-stage where you lump it all in together, you do all the studies simultaneously, and one way you might do that is in a regression model with random effects. And again, somebody's put together the evidence for which way you should go. Not much difference in two-stage or one-stage, as Debray et al. Say here, but it should be pre-specified in a protocol or an analysis plan, as occasionally they lead to different conclusions. So again, most of the time they do the same thing, but you're not going to know when that occasionally is going to crop up. And also, my experience is that the statisticians in this field they fall in one camp or other. They're in the two-stage or the one-stage camp, so it depends who you talk to. Risk of bias, quality and IPD, I won't go through that because it's very similar to what you do in a aggregate review, Cochrane or otherwise. So for Cochrane risk of bias tool and grade summary of findings for pooled outcomes. There's some very useful resources. There is, like JBI, we have methods groups in Cochrane, and so IPD is one of the methods group. They've got a nice website. They've also done a series of articles, as you can see there, so impact on clinical practice guidelines, impact on design, guidance on how you do it, some other types of study designs such as diagnostic studies, and also reporting standards. So just on reporting standards, there is a special PRISMA for IPD based on the overall PRISMA, but for example it's got three new items added. So methods for checking the integrity of the IPD, so pattern of randomisation, is that looking okay? Is the data consistent? Is there any imbalance at baseline and missing data? Secondly, reporting any important issues that emerge, and you can guarantee there will be one or more. And the third one, exploring variation, and again that's getting to some of that subgroup analysis or similar. So here is Amicable, which is an IPD that we're preparing the manuscript for publication. So smaller than those cancer ones I showed you earlier, but the same sorts of issues. So for this we had 5 trials involving just over 6,000 babies. Now I have to put this up. So in the abstract, which is there, for all to see in the published literature. Results expected to be publicly available in 2012. I'm blushing as I say this. So it's only 2016 now. But one of those things did happen in this where we were not able to get a very important part of the data. I won't go into detail, but we did manage to get it very late in the piece. And so we went almost back to square one and had to redo the analysis. So data availability is a huge issue in IPD, and we have the scars to prove it. So if we can improve that, if the systematic review evidence guideline community throughout the world can do something about this, that will be a great contribution. So back to amicable, what we're trying to do in this one was look at antenatal magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection preventing cerebral palsy, essentially. And what we were trying to drill down, we'd already done the aggregate review, but the things we couldn't get at were the reason that a woman was at risk of preterm birth, the reason that she might be given magnesium sulfate, so it might be that fetal neuroprotection, which was our primary interest, but also for preeclampsia or tocolysis, trying to extend the time before a woman gives birth. Didn't have much of we wanted a better grip on the gestational age when magnesium sulfate was given, and importantly the regimens, type, mode of administration and dosage. And importantly here, the dose planned and the dose actually given. Antenatal magnesium sulfate is quite unpleasant for the women, makes them very hot, and it may have to be given for quite a long time. There's also some literature out there that high doses may not be so good for the baby. So it's very important to know here about actual doses. So I know that that's not intention to treat, but in this case it was extremely important to know more about the actual dose because of the harm to both mother and baby, to be able to know what was the minimum effective dose. And if a woman is looking like giving birth preterm, we're not very good at predicting that, and if she's in the category where she's eligible for magnesium sulfate and she doesn't give birth for a while, it may be grams and grams of magnesium sulfate she receives through the infusion. So important, very important to know about this. So sensitivity analyses are also really important in IPD. So again, in our amicable IPD, we had a main analysis where we had multiple imputation for missing data. We omitted a trial, and we also did a sensitivity analysis imputing no for some of the missing data. Subgroup analyses, we did a lot of those, but in reference to what I was just talking about, a dose was really important to us, and so we did different thresholds, fine versus coarser grain of doses. But IPD doesn't fix everything, so one of our outcomes, cerebral palsy, as I've mentioned, in one of the 5 trials, most of the participants were from low and middle income countries, and the ascertainment of cerebral palsy, which really can only be properly done from 2 years onwards, was probably very low, and we didn't have any effective way to really impute that. So IPD helps with some sorts of missing data, but not to this degree. Okay, so that dose of magnesium sulfate that I was talking about just a little while ago, it depends on when the baby's born, how much the women can bear. So with an IPD, we could unpick and reanalyse in subgroups, and we could experiment with those different thresholds as well. So we had much more power than subgroup analysis from our aggregate review. So one of the things that we could do, that if you don't see any differences after you've done all of that, perhaps it can be interpreted as all or any dose being effective. In that case, you might translate that into the lowest effective dose is the one that should be used. IPDs have increasing connections with guidelines, as they should. So here's an example where in the earlier guideline on otitis media, they used the data from the Aggregate review, which said there weren't any differences between participant subgroups. But they reanalysed, this is a nice guideline, reanalysed it recently with the IPD, and they got a different result. So they're now saying that antibiotics, if the child's got bilateral acute otitis media and in the age range of 6 months to 2 years, which is exactly the sort of thing that we need when we're formulating recommendations for guidelines. But we're not making good use even of the fairly rare IPDs that we've got. So Vale and colleagues did a recent study where they matched 177 guidelines. 66 of those cited the relevant IPD, and 18 recommendations were based directly on the IPD. But in about half, 88 out of 154, there was no reason given for not including the IPD, and it fitted in the date range. So not making terribly good use of IPD for guidelines. I'm not going to talk about other sorts of IPD. I concentrated on therapeutics, but there's interesting work going on network meta-analysis, where you might have antidepressant drugs are the classic example, where often the trials are antidepressant versus placebo, antidepressant A versus placebo, antidepressant B versus placebo, but you really want to know what A versus B is. So that's a very short explanation about network meta-analysis. And people are starting to put together that kind of methodology with IPD, and saying that that does increase the precision and helps explain study heterogeneity. And there's a literature that does my head in around prediction, prognostic, modelling and diagnostics, so I'm certainly not going to talk about that. Okay, so big question. Is it worth doing IPD? And I was just talking to somebody at another conference I was at earlier this morning. I don't know whether they're worth doing or not. What am I going to say to you the audience? So this wise person said, well, ask the audience, so I might well do that. But my incomplete thinking so far is do the Aggregate review first. Consider how complete the IPD will be. Do you think you can get enough trials? Will enough trialists agree? Can you find the trialists? Consider IPD, particularly if you think they're going to be important effect modifiers that you can't get from Aggregate, to be able to rule in or rule out modifying effects. And if there's a potential to make more useful guideline recommendations, which dose, which groups. And I was thinking also, if you're going to go to all this work in doing IPDs, can we work with the move that's happening with the data sharing community to get together and design living IPDs, so that we don't do them the 100,000 women with breast cancer once? We try and make that living IPDs in our emerging era of data sharing. And I think that's me.